Hi, everybody. You've reached S.J. Thomason at Christian-Apologist.com, where truth matters. And I am here with Joel Edmund Anderson, who is, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about him. We're going to talk about his new book today. It's a wonderful book called Reader's Guide to the New Testament, and it focuses on sort of a blue-collar look at this. So it's coming out of his information. I'll tell you a little bit about him as we go. He's a high school teacher, an adjunct religious studies instructor, and a writer who lives in Arkansas with his son. He holds a BS in education in English, or a Bachelor of Science in English Literature, an MA in Theological Studies, an MA in Old Testament Studies, and a PhD in Old Testament. And so he's clearly an expert on the Bible. And so he's a perfect person to talk about some of the prophecies in the Old Testament and how they were fulfilled how many were fulfilled in the New Testament. And sometimes they're fulfilled twice, sometimes they're fulfilled more than once. It's a pretty good thing. And so without further ado, let me go ahead and I want to say hi to the chat. See Jansen Gunn popped in here. So good to see you, Jansen. And so Joel, you want to tell us a little bit about kind of the overview? What made you want to write this book?
Overall, like you said, my undergraduate degree was in English literature, and I got a regular teaching certificate. And after I went to Regent College and got my first master's degree, I really wanted to just teach high school, and I wanted to teach the Bible to high school because I went to a Christian high school, and the Bible classes were never that good. And so I wanted to take what I learned in the graduate level, and just make it available at a high school level, layperson level. And so basically over, 25 years, I taught at evangelical Christian schools for 16 years, most of it Bible. And there isn't a lot of good biblical study curriculum for that level. It just ain't there. And so I just started, developing my own curriculum with no idea that I'd ever make a book. And just little by little, I would take what I had studied and learned, and I had to take the academic study and make it understandable to like sophomores and juniors. And so, I just, over time, I developed all this stuff, and eventually I realized I could probably just do my own book. And so after I stopped teaching at my last Christian school, and that I think the first time we met and talked about it was when I wrote The Heresy of Ham, and that whole thing, which incidentally, second edition's coming out later this year.
Very nice.
Okay. I know we're live, but I think somebody just glitch. Hold up for 1 minute. Okay.
Oh, no worries at all. So I'll just say hi to the chat here. I see Susan is in the chat. Jansen's in the chat. I put this on X, so I'm hoping that we can get some people from X over here to talk to Joel about his book. He and I have had a conversation in prior years, number of years ago, actually, about young earth creationism. And I should tell you guys, I'm pretty excited because another little development that happened just recently. Yesterday, when I came home, I looked at my Gmail, and I had an email from a person from Reasons to Believe, which is Hugh Ross's place. And he invited me to apply to join the scholars at Reasons to Believe. And so I'm super excited about that. And so I went through the application process, and I gave a couple of references one reference for my church and one reference for my school. And so we'll see how that goes. So that's just what I wanted to tell you. I'm excited. So Joel, so you had compiled a lot of information, and over the years, and you realized you have enough really to put a book together.
Yeah. And so, by the way, if you hear something in the background, my dad has arrived, and he needs to use the outdoor table saw. So hopefully it won't be too loud.
No worries.
So I developed the book after I finished teaching at my last Christian school, and I was a part-time adjunct at University of North Alabama. Because you're part-time, got a little extra time on your hands. So I decided that's the time to try to make this into a book. And I eventually did that, developed this. The Old Testament Reader's Guide is coming out. Yep. Everybody buy it. Eventually there'll be a workbook to go along with that, which is basically a compilation of all the worksheets and questions I made for my students when I taught it. Mm-hmm. So you can kind of teach yourself. You could use it in a Sunday school group, and I'm going to do the same thing with the Old Testament. And if we're really ambitious, I might want to do something with the early church fathers.
Hmm.
But now since I'm teaching full-time high school again, I'm glad I got the majority of writing done already. Now it's just kind of the editing process. But so that's how the book came about. And it kind of sums up really a good 25 years of my graduate work and teaching mostly at the high school and college level. And the reason why it's called the Blue Collar Bible Scholar is because I worked my way through my graduate programs in college, like as a janitor. So I never saw myself as like an academic. I was always, after I did my classes, I'd go home and I'd go to work and like mop floors. So I try to get rid of all the jargon, all the academic jargon that academics sometimes like to use, like, look how smart I am. And it's just in simplest ways to understand it. So anybody who, without a Bible degree, can, in this case, pick up my book and go, okay, I want to try to understand the Gospel of Luke better, or Galatians better, or Mark better. And, with each book of the Bible, I kind of I make a kind of a literary chart so you can kind of see how all the individual parts fit together. And then I give a little bit of historical background, not too much, but just enough for you to get your bearings. And then I just take you through like a walkthrough of the entire Old Testament, in this case, New Testament. And I just kind of walk you through it. Oh, hold on. Okay, never mind. This is very odd. What you need? Okay. Say hi, Dad.
Hi.
You're on the podcast.
Yeah, we're talking about a book. So
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, you had a couple of really interesting things in there. And I just got the book 2 days ago for the people who I ordered it on Amazon, so it's very easy to find. And I hadn't had a chance to open it up until today. So I've only got to page 98, but I've gotten some good stuff in those pages. He's really organized. And so I'm in the middle of your chapter on Matthew, and I finished your chapter on Mark. And so one of the things you had in your chapter on Mark is you talked about the significance of what you called the theological burger. And you talked about Jairus's daughter and the woman who'd been menstruating, who Jesus healed, how that's all kind of put together. And I wanted to see if you wanted to say what some really cool things are about that.
What I call the theological burger, and in other places I call a theological cheeseburger because there's more levels. In academic terms, they call it a chiastic structure. Okay, and basically what that means is in any literary section that you go this way or this way. The beginning part, there's a section, and then there's a middle section. We'll just make with that one easy. You have the intro, then something happens, and then there's a central section, which is the main meat of the passage. And then the section after that parallels this section, and then the conclusion parallels the beginning. So it's parallel structures. And so in that case, this is Mark. It was in Mark 5, basically 5:21 to 43. You have let me look up my burger just to make sure I'm clear about this. Jesus gets off the boat, I believe, and he's in. It's important to realize that the section in. Sorry, I have not memorized my entire Bible. The section between 5:21 and 6:56 takes place all in Jewish territory. Okay, whereas the previous larger section of 3:20 to 5:20 takes place in Gentile territory. Okay, now why is that important? Well, I guess I have to give a little bit more context with that, if that's okay.
Oh, absolutely.
Why I need the thing. Going back to 3:20 is the Beelzebub controversy. Okay, where basically the Jewish leaders accuse Jesus of using the power of Beelzebub to cast out demons, and Jesus says basically that's stupid. Why would Satan cast out Satan? It's all about the question of kingdoms. What kingdom is he working for? Is he working for the kingdom of Beelzebub or the kingdom of God? And obviously it's the kingdom of God. Right after that, he gets on a boat, he crosses the sea to what would be Gentile territory. There's geography fits into this. And that's the section where he calms the sea, which has a lot of Jonah parallels. And what do you know about Jonah? Jonah went to Nineveh, so Jesus, like Jonah, is going to Gentile territory. He's taking the kingdom to Gentiles. Okay. Now, there's a lot of stuff in that story itself. There's a lot of ways Jesus isn't like Jonah. Jonah was rebellious, and Jesus isn't. And they go to Gentile territory, and he encounters a demoniac, and he casts him out. Then he gets back on the boat. Okay, and all that stuff is like the question of kingdoms, like who is he working for? After the demoniac in the first part of chapter 5, he gets back on the boat and he comes back to Jewish territory, and this is where we get the story. He gets off the boat, and we are told a Jewish leader, Jairus, comes to him and basically asks him to heal my daughter so she can be, some translations say healed. The actual word is saved, which spiritual healing and physical healing were seen similar. So she can be saved, healed, and live. That's like the top, that's the introduction. That's the top part of the bun. Well, that is the top bun, not top part of the bun. It's the top bun. So that's how the story starts. He's in Jewish territory, and he is asked by a Jewish leader to heal his daughter. The middle part of this section is on his way to Jairus' daughter. He encounters a woman with the flow of blood, and we're told a lot of things about this woman. We're told that she's been suffering from this condition for like 12 years. So it just says flow of blood. It was like a menstrual flow. Okay. And because of that, she was always ritually unclean. They didn't consider, she wouldn't have been considered sinful, but being ritually unclean, she could not participate in the religious life of the temple. She couldn't be part of it. So she was a little cut off from it. So the 12 years is important. It's, if you went back in time, was it literally 12 years or was it 9 years? Why does he say 12? It's obviously because it's symbolic of the 12 tribes. It's Judaism, She went to doctors. They could not heal her. Okay. So her situation could not be healed the way it was set up. She has enough faith. She touches Jesus' cloak. She is healed, or she is saved. Okay. Jesus turns around and says, "Who touched me?" And that's when she comes out and says, "I did." And what he says is, "Daughter, your faith has healed / saved you." Okay. That's the meat of the story. And then after that, he goes on to Jairus' daughter's house. He raises the girl up from the dead. And at that point, we are told the daughter is 12 years old. So as a good reader, and again, I was an English literature major, so whenever you read, especially the Gospels, they're not just random stories about Jesus's ministry. They're crafted. They're stories, and you have to look like any story. You look for parallels. You look for symbolism. So you're like, what is the connection between the woman in the meat of the story and the situation with Jairus' daughter? And you realize there's a lot of parallels. Both are referenced as daughter. Both are connected with 12 years. Okay. And both experience healing or salvation. Okay. So when you take that story as a whole, it's not just kind of random story of like, cool, Jesus can do cool stuff. It's making a statement about the purpose of his healings. As his purpose of his healings, both the woman and the daughter, obviously the woman because she was ritually impure and the daughter because she was dead, were cut off from the life of God's people. And so his healing wasn't just physical healing. It was bringing them back into the community of God's people. And so that story is more than just cool stories about his ability to heal people. It's drawing out the theological implications of what his healing is doing. Mm-hmm. But what you see, obviously, as you go through, I would say all the Gospels, they're carefully constructed narratives, and you have to look for how they fit in with other stories in the Gospels. It's fascinating. As an English major, I love understanding literature more. They are about history, but they're narrated to us as works of literature, and we need to read them just like we would, if you read Pride and Prejudice or Lord of the Rings. There's literary connections that help you understand the overall meaning of the text. So that's a fun one. Yeah.
That's really fun. And I have never thought of that. And I also never really noticed this other thing that you pointed out that also was pretty related to that. And it's the the 12 baskets of leftovers when Jesus feeds the 5,000 in Jewish territory. And then he goes over at another point and he's feeding 4,000 with 7 leftover baskets in Gentile territory. So I just wanted to see if you wanted to expand on why it's 12 for the Jewish people and it was 7 for the Gentile people.
Yeah. Well, again, though there's 2 feedings in Mark. Okay. And when you see where they show up, the feeding of the 5,000 comes at the end of a section that I call the kingdom to the Jews, where Jesus is going to his fellow Jews. And it culminates in Jesus going up on a mountain, feeding the 5,000, which is very Moses-like, bread in the wilderness kind of thing. But the fact is that it comes right after the feeding of the 5,000 comes right after the story of how Herod has beheaded John the Baptist. And there's literary connections between those 2 stories. The whole point of that is Herod is technically the king of the Jews, but he's a bad king who slaughters the flock. Whereas right after that, you get the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000, where he is portrayed as the good shepherd who is feeding God's flock. So Jesus is the king of the Jews, not Herod. And feeds 5,000. They pick up 12 baskets full of leftovers. Why 12? Well, this section is all about Jesus going to the Jews, right? But he also goes to the Gentiles. And the next section, which starts in basically 7 and 8, he then goes to Gentile territory. And there's a second feeding, which is often overlooked. But the second feeding where he feeds 4,000 happens outside of the promised land. Okay. And anybody from that time period would know, this is outside the promised land. This is not promised land stuff. This is outside the promised land stuff. And they pick up 7 baskets of leftovers. Why is 7 significant? Because all throughout the Bible, 7 is God's number. It's the number of completion. That's why you have the 7 days of the week. In Revelation, you have the 7 trumpets and the 7 bowls. It's God's thing. And so when they get back in the boat after that one, the disciples are complaining, and Jesus kind of gives them a lesson. It's like, don't you get what this means? And they don't. But it's expected that the readers should get what it means. The kingdom is going to the Jews. The 5,000 gets 12 baskets left over. But it's also eventually going to go to the Gentiles. And it's going to fill up God's people. The kingdom of God will eventually go to God's people, go to the Gentiles, which will obviously be part of God's people as well. And so, again, that's a literary thing that you have to read the Gospels from that perspective and look for how these connections are made, because they're making, I would say, theological, Christological statements through the literature. And so you have to learn how to read the literature well. You have to be good readers of it and not just treat it as just random stories about Jesus. They're crafted, and so you have to learn how to do that better. So yeah.
And you referenced a lot. I mean, we talked a lot about prophecies. In your book, I've already seen tons of references to prophecies. You have prophecies from Zechariah, like Zechariah 9:9. You talk a lot about Isaiah 7:14 with the virgin's going to give birth. So you did your what?
I did my PhD on.
Really? Oh, you want to share a little bit more on that verse and how some people say, oh, it's a young woman. It definitely can't be. Yeah. It can't be a virgin. But you're saying that.
Well, too often I think fulfilled prophecy. Let's put it this way: growing up in Wheaton, Illinois, in the heart of evangelicalism, and going to a good Christian school in high school, it was always taught to me that basically, I'm simplifying this, but I think people will understand this. That fulfilled prophecy in the New Testament basically means Old Testament prophets way back when made predictions that eventually came true 800, 400 years later. I don't think that's the correct way to understand what fulfilled prophecy in the New Testament is. And for example, Isaiah 7:14, that's the virgin will be with child, name him Emmanuel. That's a very popular one. So I'll see if I can summarize my entire 300 plus page thesis in a couple sentences. You have to realize that when the Old Testament, let's just go back to Old Testament prophets. Old Testament prophets were speaking God's word to their communities at that time. The inspired message they were given was directed at people at that time. So it had to mean something and be relevant to them at that time. perfect example would be Isaiah 7:14. If you read that verse in the context of Isaiah 7, that takes place that takes place during what was called the Syro-Ephraimite crisis. And again, most people don't know what this is. It was a huge deal that shapes so much of the 7th and 8th century BC. Mm-hmm. And basically what happened, and again, you could read this in the beginning of chapter 7. The northern kingdom of Israel and the neighboring country of Aram or Syria, depending on your translation, it seems like they were going to team up and invade Judah. This was during King Ahaz's reign, probably early on in King Ahaz's reign, mid 8th century. I date it to like 742, but it's around that time. And we are told at the beginning of Isaiah 7 that there was this threat. Isaiah and his court were afraid. Isaiah comes to him and he basically says, don't worry, put your faith in Yahweh and he will save you. These guys aren't going to hurt you. And basically Ahaz says, screw that. I'm calling up Assyria. They're the big world power. They can really save me. So he refuses to put his faith in the God of Israel, which isn't surprising because he's not a faithful guy. In response to his lack of faith and his decision to call up Assyria to help him instead, Isaiah launches into basically the rest of Isaiah 7 all the way to Isaiah 12. That whole section, 7 through 12, is a number of prophecies, but specifically in Isaiah 7, where Isaiah basically tells Ahaz, you are an idiot. Here's Joel's really simplified paraphrase version. You're rejecting Yahweh's help and you're going to call up Assyria. So here's what's going to happen. Assyria is going to come in and they're going to do away with this threat of the northern kingdom and Aram for sure, but they're not going to leave. They're going to put their boot on your neck and they're going to oppress you for a long time, you idiot. And it's because you did not put your faith in Yahweh. But look at the Alma. That's the Greek word, the Hebrew word, which is sometimes translated as young woman, sometimes translated as virgin. Look at the Alma. She is with child. By the time that child is born and grows up, Assyria is going to come in and wreak havoc. So right there, that tells you, even though that's later applied to Jesus, it had to mean something at that time. Mm-hmm. Okay. And a lot of, ancient rabbis and stuff, they say that the Emmanuel child was understood to be Hezekiah. And I think in the original context, it does, because it fits in with the larger context of the first part of Isaiah, specifically 1 through 39 or 7 through 39, really. That part was what my PhD was about, how 7 through 12 in the Syro-Ephraimite crisis formed Isaiah's prophecy of what was going to happen because of Ahaz's lack of faithfulness. And 36 to 39, which is about the Sennacherib's invasion, when King Hezekiah, Ahaz's son, is threatened from Assyria, and he does put his faith in Yahweh, and Yahweh saves Jerusalem because of his faith. So Ahaz and Hezekiah are set up as parallels, contrary to each other in the first part of Isaiah. So what you get in Isaiah 7 through 12 is Isaiah's prophecy, and then the initial fulfillment regarding Hezekiah happens in 36 to 39. And that sets up a prophecy fulfillment, which justified, what's the word I'm looking for? It showed that Isaiah was a true prophet, because the mark of a true prophet is, does he prophesy come true? If he prophesies something and it doesn't come true, then he's not a true prophet. We don't have to keep his writings. But if what he prophesies comes true, we're going to hold on to them because he clearly spoke right. A good example would be in Jeremiah, when he's confronted, when he tells, I think it's Zedekiah, don't rebel against Babylon. The yoke is going to be on your neck. You got to accept the yoke. Mm-hmm. And another prophet, Hananiah, says, no, God's going to break the yoke. Well, guess what happened? At the time, Hananiah was lauded and Jeremiah was put in jail. But when Babylon came and destroyed them all, mm-hmm. people realized, oh, Hananiah's prophet, he was a false prophet. That's why we don't have the book of Hananiah. They got rid of his writings because they were false. They kept Jeremiah's writing because what he prophesied came true. The same holds for Isaiah. If what he prophesied in Isaiah 7 through 12 had not seemed to become true at that time, sometime within his lifetime, they wouldn't have kept it, right? But because they kept it, later on, in later generations, they used that prophetic word in the 8th century as a template to understand what God was doing later on. And so when you get to the second half of Isaiah, when they're coming out of the exile, the suffering servant, he's seen very much kind of similar to the Emmanuel thing. Now, this is a lot. And so they're trying to understand their redemption out of Babylonian exile against the template of that. God's going to use a royal figure to bring salvation. So you have the royal figure of Hezekiah, the suffering servant, which I think in the original context of the Babylonian exile would have been seen as the remnant of Israel. God's going to work through the remnant to bring salvation, who went into exile, suffered, but then God brought them out, right? With that, then when you get to the New Testament and Jesus comes, how do you explain the significance of who Jesus is? That's why in the New Testament, when you get the quotes from Isaiah, they're basically saying, look back at Isaiah 7:14. Jesus is like that, but a lot bigger. The original Emmanuel child was Hezekiah, and God used Hezekiah, the Davidic Messiah, because that's what an anointed one king would be, to save his people from Assyrian oppression. Jesus is the ultimate Messiah who's faithful. He's going to save us from ultimately demonic oppression. So he's like Hezekiah, but bigger. The same thing goes for the suffering servant stuff in the second part of Isaiah. Jesus is like Israel coming out of exile. The only difference is when Israel came out of exile, they kept on screwing up. Jesus didn't. He's the ultimate suffering servant. So all that's to say is if you come to these fulfilled prophecies with just the notion that they were just predictions that they held on to for 800 years that finally came true like a Nostradamus type of thing, I don't think that's the right way to understand fulfilled prophecy. Fulfilled prophecy it's building on previous prophecies that have been fulfilled, and now there's an extra layer of meaning related to Jesus.
Yeah, that's very good explanation. So it kind of reminds me, though, kind of going back into this prophecy thing, and what your book also mentions. You talk a bit about Daniel, and you actually start the book off talking about Antiochus Epiphanes and how that's important for us to know about, like the whole Maccabean revolt and how significant that was, and how it was fulfilled. It was a fulfillment of one of the predictions that Daniel had made, and then also we have Jesus, and you mentioned this also, Jesus mentioning the what was it called, the abomination of desolation. Yes. And so there's the idea that could be that could occur again, the abomination of desolation, and could have occurred in the year 70 with the second temple, or could it occur in the future? So it could still it could keep reoccurring. And so I just wanted to see if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, it's really important to understand the intertestamental period that leads into the first century, particularly basically after Alexander the Great died and broke up his kingdom. Those who ruled over the promised land at that point, the worst one, Antiochus Epiphanes, which is talked about in Daniel. And again, this is another thing. Daniel 7, which is his vision of the 4 beasts coming out of the sea. And it's a very apocalyptic, weird vision. But if you understand it in the context of Antiochus Epiphanes and the Maccabean revolt, I think it makes sense. The initial fulfillment, if you will, was seen as the little horn on the 4th beast would have been Antiochus Epiphanes. He's oppressing God's people, the Jews. But then one like the Son of Man comes and defeats the little horn. That one like the Son of Man in Daniel 7 is not coming from heaven to earth. He's ascending to heaven to be seated at the right hand of God. He is given glory to defeat the forces of evil, which in the original context would have been Antiochus Epiphanes. Obviously, when Judas Maccabeus pushed him out, the ultimate Messiah didn't come. So they were still looking for how will God eventually bring about his kingdom. in full. And so when Jesus comes along, the New Testament writers often refer to places in Daniel to talk about Jesus. Jesus is like that, but bigger again. And so what was the abomination of desolation? And so what you get, and this is another misunderstood passage. It's in Mark 13. The parallel is in Matthew 24 and Luke 21. It's the Olivet Discourse. Again, growing up in evangelicalism, I was always taught, because it was Hal Lindsey and Tim LaHaye, it was all future prediction of nuclear war and the Chinese and Russians. It's not. I don't think it is. The context of those chapters in Matthew, Mark, and Luke is Jesus has just the day before, I think, or maybe a few days before, he's gone in for the triumphal entry, where they expect him, like Judas Maccabeus, after he defeated Antiochus Epiphanes. Judas Maccabeus rode into Jerusalem on a horse. They hailed him, and he came in and he cleansed the temple. Okay, so that's what Jesus' followers were expecting him to do. Instead, what he does, and we all know this, he goes in and he doesn't cleanse the temple. He basically symbolically trashes it. And he quotes Jeremiah. And Jeremiah is known as the prophet who prophesied the destruction of the temple. So he doesn't cleanse anything. If you have your Bibles and the subtitle says Jesus cleansed the temple, you can cross out cleanses and say trashes, or something. And he quotes Jeremiah. And what gets him into trouble in that Passion Week is he got in trouble with the temple authorities, because the temple authorities realized he's saying we're the bad ones, not necessarily Rome. Should we pay taxes? Yeah, okay, sure. That's not really important. What is important? The temple leadership. After all these conflicts with the temple leadership, you have the Olivet Discourse. And the disciples ask him, when is all this going to happen? Basically, when is the temple going to be destroyed? And this is the major thing, I think, in Jesus' prophetic ministry at this point, which I think leads to the writing down of the Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, because most scholars think that Mark was written, sometimes in the late 60s, early 70s. Matthew and Luke were this 70s, 80s, something like that. Why were they written down at that point? It's because the Jewish war happened in 66 to 70, and the temple was destroyed. And so I think the impetus for the Synoptic Gospels for being written down was basically when the Christians saw this transpiring, the mounting Jewish war, which Josephus writes about, and eventually I want to write a novel about it. They realized what Jesus prophesied 40 years earlier at the end of his ministry was about to happen. Again, a prophet, to be legitimized, to be as a true prophet, his prophecies typically has to come true within a lifetime, to solidify. Not solidify. What's the word I'm looking for? Verify.
Verify, justify the fact that they call him a prophet.
Yeah.
And so you'd see prophets coming to life in the lifetime, and then also right after.
Yeah.
And so,
but if a prophet prophesies something and it doesn't happen either within his lifetime or shortly after, they're going to decide he's not a true prophet. Okay. Mm-hmm. So I think the destruction of the temple in 70 AD was verification of what Jesus prophesied on the Mount of Olives. And when you look at the Olivet Discourse, it's very apocalyptic again. It's very hard to understand. One of the things he talks about, which is really interesting in Matthew and Mark. Okay, it's another interesting thing when you compare Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There's a lot of similarities to them, obviously, mm-hmm. but you pay attention to where they change. So in Mark, the earliest gospel, which is kind of ambiguous at times, Jesus tells his disciples, when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it shouldn't, then you got to run to the hills. It's like, what the heck does that mean? Now, if you're a Jew and you know the story of Daniel, you're like, okay, if something bad happens to the temple, it's time for Jesus' followers to get out of the city. But Mark is very ambiguous. You go to Matthew, and Matthew clarifies a little bit. And he says, Matthew has Jesus say, when you see the abomination of desolation standing in the temple, where Mark was just standing where it should not. So Matthew clarifies things that are a little foggy in Mark. But then you get to Luke, and Luke's audience is primarily Gentiles. And they don't know the Jewish history and they wouldn't catch an abomination of desolation reference. So Luke, in that section where Matthew and Mark reference the abomination of desolation, Luke changes it to just have Jesus say, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, get out of the city. Well, kind of a reference to the Roman armies coming down during the Jewish war. Mm-hmm. But all that is to say is Jesus' use of the abomination of desolation, he's not saying that Daniel back then predicted this necessarily on some simplistic way. He's using that as a grid to understand what is going on at his time, right? And so, and again, I think all this gets to when you get to the topic of, especially in the Gospels, how the New Testament writers use the Old Testament. The best thing to do, in my opinion, is whenever a gospel writer references the Old Testament or says thus was fulfilled, go back to that section in the Old Testament, read the fuller context, understand what the fuller context is. Then, in light of that, go back to the passage in the New Testament. It's like, how does this fuller context impact how I'm understanding this story here in the New Testament? And I'll give you one example, which I really like. When Jesus is up on the cross and he says, my God, why have you forsaken me?
Oh my gosh, I was just going to ask you that. Psalm 22. I was just going to ask you that. Oh my gosh, that is so crazy.
Growing up, I can't tell you how many times it was either in a Bible class or sermons, that was when God turned his back on Jesus because he couldn't look at this, And I was like, okay, I guess, sure. But then what I think you should do is, Jesus knows the full psalm. And what he's doing, and this happens a lot, biblical scholar Richard Hayes, echoes of the Old Testament in Scripture, I think he really points this out a lot. If I say to you as an example, let's say we're talking about the 4th of July. Trust me, I'll make sense of this. Let's say we're talking about the 4th of July, and I say something, can you say, what am I talking about? What am I referencing?
Early light.
Yeah, I'm clearly referencing the Star Spangled Banner. But if you're not an American and you don't know the American culture, you're like, okay, you'd be like, okay, say, can you see, what are you talking about? But that little line I just told you opens up the whole song, patriotism. I only have to say that one line and you know what I'm talking about, right? Mm-hmm. So when Jesus is on the cross and he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's his indication to everybody. It's like, look at Psalm 22, not just that one verse. Look at the whole thing. That's happening. And so when you go back and you read all of Psalm 22, it starts with the writer feeling forsaken by God. And then he thinks back about how God saved his people in the past, but my life sucks now. Everybody's beating me up. But by halfway through the Psalm 22, especially by the end, you realize that God hasn't forsaken him and that now he's praising God's name in the midst of all his brothers, his people of God. So the way I see that now, when Jesus is on the cross and says, my God, why have you forsaken me? He's not saying God is turning his back. He's basically saying to the crowd, you think God has forsaken me, but I know how the psalm ends. I'll see you back in 3 days because he's not going to forsake me. And it's a sign of, initially it sounds hopeless, but the way the psalm ends, you know what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. And so again, that's where the New Testament use of the Old Testament, it's always important to go back to the Old Testament, try to understand that fuller passage, and then interpret it. Use that template to interpret the specific New Testament passage, and you learn so much more. And the New Testament becomes a lot more rich and more depth and more texture. I think it's fabulous. And it's just
I agree with you. And I mean, I kind of want to build on that, talking about Psalm 22 first, just in case people don't know. If you go in there, you're going to see it says his hands and his feet were pierced and they divided up his clothes. And so wolves surround me. So it's basically exactly what happened at the cross. But it kind of also is very similar to Isaiah 53, because Isaiah 53, we have the whole story starting with Isaiah 52:17, the whole story of how this person's beat beyond recognition. It's horrible. He's pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. And then all of a sudden it says kind of like what you said with Psalm 22, all of a sudden, but he will see the light Like in the Dead Sea Scrolls, that light part sometimes gets taken out of English translations, but he will see the lights in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so that's a pretty neat thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But, and specifically with Isaiah 53, that's another one where, again, my view is a little bit nuanced. I don't think that's just a simple Nostradamus type prediction. I think there is an original context. And in that context, it's talking about the remnant who has suffered in exile. God will bring them out of exile. You know, I mean, just like Ezekiel's Valley of Dry Bones, which is about the coming out of the exile. He sees a valley of dry bones. He prophesies over them. The spirit goes back into the bones. They revive into an army. Okay. What is that about? It's basically equating the Jews coming out of the Babylonian exile to a resurrection of the nation. Right. And so similarly, the suffering servant is ultimately, because if you look at the references to Yahweh's servant in Isaiah 40 to 55, there's a number of them. The other ones are clearly identify Israel as God's servant who suffers. And Isaiah 53, in the original context, I think it's personifying the remnant of Israel, the Jews coming out, as God's suffering servant. They're the redeemed remnant through whom God is going to bring salvation to the nations. Now, that's the initial fulfillment. Given that, when you get to the New Testament, and the New Testament writers quote that and refer to Jesus, they're basically saying what God was working through then, the remnant, is now coming to fulfillment in Christ. It's not just prediction 800 years later comes true. It's okay. Here, I'm going to use a visual. Let's use this. We all have like cups or stuff that like sometimes there's lines on, designs. I view prophecy, and specifically the idea of fulfilled prophecy. Let's say there's a line here, line here, line here, line here. When God starts with Abraham, makes his promises to Abraham that he's going to create a great nation, and through that nation he's going to bless all nations. He's starting to this is the bottle of salvation. He starts working through Abraham. He starts filling it up. And so there's certain things that he does in the life of Abraham. Then you get to Moses and Israel. Well, Moses and Israel during the Exodus, God is now making the great nation that he promised to Abraham, right? So he's filling it up. But then later on, you get to the Davidic stuff. Okay, it's not just going to be through this nation that he's going to bless all nations. He's going to use the leader, the king of Israel. Okay, then there's the prophecies about David. But it's not just going to be that. Then there's going to be other, everything is built on kind of like Legos. And so when you get to up here, this is like the cap is Jesus in the life of Jesus. When the New Testament writers get here, when they say Old Testament prophecy was fulfilled in Jesus, they're going back and showing it's not just there's a prophecy down here that finally came true here. It's what God was doing here is now coming to fulfillment. It's from our perspective, it seems like prediction for, coming true, but it's more nuanced than that. It's everything God has been doing in the Old Testament is now coming to full fruition. Fulfillment literally means filling up, not just saying something, waiting 800 years for it to happen later. There's a progression of God's work in God's people. So, and it's fun.
I agree with it. I think it's really fun. And I mean, just going back, and you had detailed this a little bit in your book. And in case you guys are just joining now, I want to say hi to everybody in the chat. Welcome here. I know I've got even a couple of non-believers in the chat. So we've got some believers and some non-believers, a nice mix of people. But we are looking at Joel's book. It's blue collar. It's basically blue collar reader's guide to the New Testament. Yeah, he's got it right there too. You can get it on Amazon. He really digs in. I've only made it to page 98 so far, but he really digs in to the Old Testament, the unification. It digs into each of the chapters. We talked about Mark, talking about Matthew right now. And I wanted to ask you, because you did mention kind of in passing, and I have a different view of something that you have. You said a lot of scholars mention that they think that some of the Gospels were written around the year 70, based on the fact that the temple was destroyed in the year 70, and that was the impetus to write the books down so that people would be warned to get away from that. But my little bit of pushback, and I just wanted to see what you say on this, is I'm wondering why the author of Acts, which is Luke, which was written after he wrote Luke, why he would have mentioned the stoning of Stephen and, of course, the martyrdom of James, the son of Zebedee. But then he didn't mention the martyrdoms of Peter or Paul, which we know did occur in the 60s. So I'm just wondering what your take on why, because that to me dates it even earlier than 70.
I mean, honestly, it's possible. I'm just saying the general scholarly consensus places Mark in the 60s, Matthew and Luke 70s or 80s. And generally speaking, okay. But yeah, that is something that is interesting that, there's why does he not mention the martyrdoms of Peter and Paul, which happened in the mid 60s? And you would think maybe he wrote it before that happened, which is, it is possible. I mean, it's, I'm not, I always just stick to the scholarly general consensus because that's a good roadmap to work through. I mean, it's possible that Luke was planning to write a third volume and then didn't do it. But yeah, it is. I mean, there was a book written a couple of years ago. I forgot the name of it. Overall, it was a little dry, but he made the argument that a lot of these books are a lot earlier, and it is possible.
Yeah, I like that you have an open mind on it.
I mean, it's one of those things that I think sometimes scholars have to realize that there are a lot of things that you just have to go, yeah, maybe we don't know everything, like specifically. We don't know all the details. A lot of it, like even how I understand the Old Testament use in the New Testament, I think it makes sense. And I think for the most part, it makes sense and it works. I'm sure, when I die and go to heaven, God's going to go, well, you were wrong here and here and here, it's possible, but that's how we learn. But yeah, the fact that in Acts ends with Paul's imprisonment in Rome, that would put it in around 64, which if Acts is 64, then Luke would have been earlier. And if Luke is earlier, then, so it is possible. I mean, it's also possible. And again, it's complete speculation. Ultimately, if scholars are honest, they would, and I think most are. It's possible that, like, I don't think when Mark wrote the Gospel of Mark, I don't think like he sat down in, 66 AD and wrote it from scratch. I think what you get, and this is why I think you get, there's huge sections in Mark that are just verbatim in Matthew and Luke, rearranged and stuff. But I think these stories weren't just written down for the first time in Mark. These were the stories that the early Christians were teaching in those first 30, 40 years. I think Mark probably took them and combined them together in his gospel, but he wasn't writing them out of whole cloth. He was taking the stories that had been passed on orally. And so there is that progression of writing. And so Luke could have done the same thing at the same time. I mean, who knows? But generally speaking, at the very least, Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written right around the time of the Jewish temple. And I think Jansen Gunn said, what would be a good reason not to mention the destruction of the temple? I think Matthew, Mark, and Luke kind of do with the Olivet Discourse. They're saying Jesus prophesied this, what you're experiencing right now. And so, and I think the Jewish war and the destruction of the temple was the impetus for the putting together of the Gospels as we now have them. It's the testimony of what Jesus did and prophesied that validates him as Messiah and prophet,
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. I mean, the whole thing is, no matter what, I do affirm that I believe that the Bible is the Word of God, and I believe it's God breathing. Some people say God breathed or God breathing, so you can look at that in different ways. And so I think it's a fascinating book. I'm curious. I noticed that you picked, and I'm kind of like this too. I like the ESV, and I noticed that most of your quotes are from the ESV. And I was just wondering, what's your reason? Like the English Standard Version, I tend to, what I do is I look at certain passages in these different English versions, and I look at which ones I think fit the story the best and all that kind of stuff. But why did you pick the ESV? Is there something about it that you really like?
Well, I mean, when it comes to translations other than my own, which
you've done your own translation. Have you done it? You know the Hebrew text, like since you studied the Old Testament. Can you?
Hold on, let me show you. Hopefully, I won't hit my camera.
Oh, wow.
Shameless promotion here. It's just self-publication. I'm not famous enough to get
Well,
an actual
you've got
publisher.
just to mention this, I have read one of your other books that I have to say you talked about the history of Christianity. That is an amazing book.
Oh, yeah.
So,
Well, let's
that's,
do shameless plugs. Yeah, this one right here.
yes, that is a really good
Yeah.
book.
Yep.
Very, very good.
And
It was actually, I think it predated Tom Holland's
Second
Dominion,
edition.
but it's kind of similar in a way. You trace a lot of really interesting stuff.
Probably, yeah. Second edition of this is coming out hopefully later this year. We can talk about that. That's about the young Earth creationism debate. But yeah.
No, Nathaniel's here. I didn't block anybody. Sorry, Nathaniel. We haven't been commenting on people's comments in here. It's a couple of non-believers in here. So
I wasn't. I'll try to look. But yeah, what I did over time when I left Regent College in '97, just to keep up with my Greek and later Hebrew, because I later took Hebrew, I just kept on doing little translation exercises for years. And then probably mid 2000 teens, I realized I got a lot of the Bible done just through. And so I decided to make sure I finished it off. And it just self-published on Amazon. Like, this is my New Testament. I call it the JAV, Joel Anderson version, more of a kind of a joke, because my first teaching gig in California, it was at a high school. And again, when I was teaching the kids, sometimes I would translate that passage so we could discuss it, so I could, and the kids then, who are now probably, they're probably 40, they were like, yeah, you should do your own translation, call it the JAV, ha ha ha. And so when I finally got around to it, I had to do that as a joke. But that's that.
So that's your translation of the New Testament?
That's my translation of the New Testament.
Let me ask you a question. Yeah. Do you include the last, because you mentioned a little bit about the last chapters of Mark, and if you have Acts 8:37 in there?
Yeah, I have it in there, but I have a note so that people know, like, okay, this is, because you have to have it in there, but at the same time, you have to note there is some textual questions. But the Old Testament is a lot bigger, and I couldn't get access to the really thin pages. Mm-hmm. So the Old Testament I had to do in 3 volumes. And so I do the Torah and former prophets, which is in the Tanakh, in the Jewish Bible, what they call the former prophets is what we call the history books, which is really interesting when you think of the Jews see Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings as prophetic, which gives you a different understanding of prophetic. I would say basically that's a prophetic looking back at their history, because they were probably written during the exile, looking back at their history, just to make sense of why did we end up in exile. Here you go, because you're a bunch of screw ups. And so I did that, and then I just did a volume of the prophets, just straight up Old Testament prophets, and then the 3rd section in the Hebrew Bible is called the writings, and that's like the poetry.
When do you do all this stuff? You've been very busy, as Jansen's pointed out. I want to say hi to everybody in the chat. Mr. Greeny and Jansen and Linguist, Amo and Slam are in, and
a lot of it was just over time. Like the translation thing just happened literally over a couple of decades, just doing it little by little. But then when I was kind of forced out of my last teaching job at that last Christian school, I got a job as a part-time adjunct at University of North Alabama. And so basically I was working part-time for a number of years. So I had some time on my hands. So I tried to make it fit. And so I just took all the stuff that I'd been working on at that point, and I thought, I'm going to write some books and see if nothing else, it kind of condenses, everything I've learned and stuff. But yeah, so I have those. And then eventually, like I said, I'm going to have an Old Testament version of the Reader's Guide eventually. I've had it done. It's just kind of in the pipeline with this publisher. And then eventually I'm doing a volume where I kind of paraphrase and make more readable a lot of the early church fathers. Because a lot of Christians, especially evangelical Christians, don't know anything about the early church fathers, which is kind of a shame, because they're fascinating. And so as I learned more about them, I thought, that'd be kind of a fun project. So
I agree.
There's my commercial. Buy all my books.
Yeah, well, you did talk about, in your book, you did give us legitimization for, say, oh shoot, this silly dryer that we have has this dumb buzzer. You did mention like Papias and how it verifies basically Matthew and Mark and Luke and that kind of thing, and how that's important to mention. I don't know if he does Luke too, but I know you said Matthew and Mark. So
we only have fragments of him. So
yeah. Yeah, no, that's really good. And so I was just wondering also, so what do you think is a prophecy that people haven't talked about as much? Because we talk about Psalm 22 and Isaiah
Oh, gosh.
53, but there's some that probably don't get as much airtime.
Well, I don't. Oof.
Well, what about, let me ask you this. I'll go back into one of my favorites that I've kind of been diving into a little bit lately. So Genesis 3:15. So we've got this idea of the offspring of the serpents and that
Mhm.
the woman's
Yeah.
seed. So the
Mhm.
woman's going to have seed. So it's basically the idea of the
Offspring.
virgin giving,
Yeah.
so not coming from the man, and that he's going to crush the seed. The offspring's going to crush
Mhm.
his head,
Mhm.
and he's going to the serpent is
heel.
going to try to crush the heel. And so
Yeah.
I'm thinking of how do you think that works into some of the New Testament?
Well, that's an interesting thing because that actually, Genesis 3 is part of a larger unit of Genesis 1 through 11, and that's a whole section in itself. But what I would say is in Genesis 3, right after the man and the woman eat the fruit and God comes down and condemns things, right away there is hope. Turns to the serpent and he says that very thing, there's going to be basically enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. Enmity is basically, there's a war. War is going to be declared. All right. In the context of the Old Testament, because this Genesis 1 through 11 sets up the Old Testament narrative. Did you finish? All right. All right. No problem. Say bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
In that context, I argue that Old Testament Israel would have seen, obviously the serpent is, I'm simplifying, like the evil one. Okay, we'll just say that. What is the war between the serpent and the woman, and the serpent's offspring and the woman's offspring? Well, when you go through Genesis 1 through 11, you have all these weird genealogies that people try to figure out. What I want people to realize is that right after that, you have the story of Cain and Abel. Okay. And the way God talks to Cain, is very similar to one of the curses of the man and the woman. Okay. I'm trying to think about how it, your desire. Well, one of the curses is to the woman is your desire will be for your husband, but he will rule over you. Okay. It doesn't mean you're going to love your husband really well. You're going to try to dominate him, but he's going to dominate you. So basically the subjugation of women is a result of the fall. That's kind of what the point is. That's the same language when God talks to Cain. Sin is crouching at your door, and its desire is for you. It wants to dominate you. Cain gave into it, right? Abel didn't, but Abel was killed, so Seth. So all of a sudden in Genesis 4, you have offspring. One succumbs to temptation to sin, one doesn't. Oh, and then you go on. Noah. Ham does stuff kind of bad, where the other two sons do stuff good. There is a war between the offspring. It doesn't mean Ham or Cain were like literally serpent people, obviously. It's symbolic. Like, there's going to be a war within humanity between those who strive for God and those who don't. And when you get to the end of the genealogies in Genesis 11, you realize that all the bad countries in the Old Testament, like Babylon, Assyria, Egypt, Sodom, they all line up in what would be considered the serpent's offspring. Whereas in the Hebrews come from the line, the woman's offspring. And when I do come out with my Old Testament Reader's Guide, I have a chart where you kind of see this. But the point is, in the Old Testament, Israel would have seen itself as the woman's offspring fighting against the nations who are the serpent's offspring. Okay. And that you see that all throughout the Old Testament. The interesting thing is when you get to the New Testament, in the really easy to understand New Testament book of Revelation, you have in Revelation 13, the apocalyptic vision of the dragon pursuing the woman clothed with the sun, and she gives birth. And the dragon wants to eat the baby, and the son gets taken up to heaven. Obviously, that's Jesus. Now, who's the woman clothed with the son? Some people think it's Mary specifically. I think it's symbolically Israel. Jesus comes from Israel. he is the ultimate offspring, right? And what you see then is when he's taken away, we are told specifically that then the dragon went to make war against the rest of the woman's offspring. That's clearly a reference to Genesis 3:15, right?
Now, is it possible? Let me ask you this,
Yeah.
Joel, because I'm actually literally writing a book called Clothed with the Sun, spelled S-O-N. And I believe it's three things. I believe that it is Mother Mary because she gave birth to the ruler of the world, and the fact that the serpent is an individual and the child Jesus is an individual. I've gone back to people like Brant Petrie, who's talks a lot about that. He's also has a terminal degree in the related field. So, but that's one of the things he talks about, the woman being Mary for that reason. But it could also represent Israel for sure. And it could also, there's a third one that Michael Heiser brings up for that. And that's the idea of the woman being a constellation of stars, like the Virgo in that constellation. And the way that he talks about it, it's really cool. He kind of maps it all out. And so that's one of my favorite passages in the whole Bible.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, again, especially when you get to apocalyptic literature, I mean, it's so symbolic. There's a lot of ways you can, at the very least, I mean, I would say at the very least, it could be Mary. It could be, I haven't heard about the Michael Heiser explanation. At the very least, though, I think it does make sense that it's Old Testament Israel because Christ comes from Israel. He's the ultimate offspring. And then who are the rest of the woman's offspring? It's from John's perspective, it's the Christians. And so when the dragon, who is obviously a serpent figure, he goes to make war with the rest of the woman's offspring, that's a reference to the church.
Exactly.
And the very next chapter, in chapter 13, the dragon, Daniel reference, stands by the edge of the sea. And what comes out? A beast. Not four beasts, but one beast that's a combination of the four beasts of Daniel 7. And so you see the beast out of the sea is kind of like the offspring of the dragon. And what does the beast do? Makes war with the saints. So you have the whole story in Genesis 3:15 about the war declared play out in this cosmic level in Revelation. And so yeah, once you realize that, and once you realize the context of Revelation, as John is writing to Christians in the first century who are persecuted by Rome, then personally, when I read stuff from like Hal Lindsey or Tim LaHaye about how it's actually nuclear weapons, and like, no, don't project it into the future like modern times. It's first century context. That's the inspired meaning. Understand that, and then you could apply it to, I think Revelation, for example, is very applicable to any times Christians are being persecuted, any time in history. In a sense, Stalin was a type of beast. Hitler was a type of beast. But John wasn't predicting them specifically, And I think that's how we need to come across these things. So.
Yeah, no, that's great. And so, yes, Susan, I would just want to say people were wondering what my middle name is. So my middle name is named after my mom. So my name's Stephanie Jean. I was originally
Jean.
Stephanie Jean Powers. Now I'm Stephanie Jean. If I take my confirmation name, Catherine Powers Thomason. But the reason I'm mentioning that the Catherine, actually, my mom's name's Jean. My mom's sister, Stephanie. And so I wanted to give my mom's other sister another name. So I picked Catherine of Siena because her name's Catherine. And so that's all. So just bringing that out there. So. So which denomination of Christianity are you affiliating with?
I am now, and I've been since end of 2006. I'm an Orthodox. I grew up in the evangelicalism, just in the way I kind of went on. I think in college, I got into the writings of Thomas Merton, the Catholic monk, and there was something more insightful and more in depth than what I was getting in standard evangelicalism, which again, I have nothing bad against evangelicalism. It's just,
I think it's called Resurrecting Orthodoxy, your website. Yeah. Okay. And
so it was just growing up, evangelicalism, it was what I grew up in. There was a lot of great stuff about it. I wouldn't change it. But at some point when I got in my late teens and early 20s, it just, a lot of it wasn't necessarily wrong, but just kind of thin, it wasn't rooted, because you're not rooted in the ancient church. You don't know a lot of things. And so it's just in my own walk, I got into Thomas Merton, and then I got into some Orthodox writers. And the more I read, the more ancient faith, the more liturgical stuff, I really like this. This is kind of what I'm always thinking about, that, And then when I moved to Little Rock for the first time in 2007, 2003, there was an Orthodox church in the area, and I've never been to an Orthodox church. And I went, and I just had this feeling that within 5 minutes of going into the liturgy, it was like, I'm home. This is it. It was a conviction, I guess. And so I eventually became Orthodox. And then I moved to Alabama for 16 years, and there was no Orthodox church there, so I couldn't go to an Orthodox church for 16 years. But now I'm back in Little Rock, and it's been really good. So
that's excellent. I like that. So it's a good
but
story.
I think it's important. Speaking more to the evangelical world, I'm not one of those who think you have to become Orthodox or you're not a real Christian. I think anybody, especially evangelicals, a little study of church tradition and the early church fathers can only help your faith. Even if you don't become Catholic or Orthodox, just understanding a little bit more of the depth and the ancientness of the faith, it solidifies you. It doesn't, a lot of things that would freak your typical evangelical out. You're like, oh, that was dealt with back at that council. It's no need to worry about it,
Yeah, I love that.
So, yeah.
So, well, let me ask you this, and I don't want to not ask you this, because there was a little fight going on a couple of years ago, it was 1 or 2 years ago, where there was a woman called Francesca Stavrokopoulou, and she wrote a book on God's anatomy, his supposed anatomy. And so you wrote a series of blog responses, which I was following, and a lot of the people here in this chat were also following with me on Twitter when it was Twitter. And so I just wanted to see, did you want to make any comments on that whole thing?
That whole thing was just bizarre to me. Because it started, it was, it's David Falk, right?
Yeah, David Falk.
Because his comment about her, which again, I said back then, I'll say now, probably wasn't the best thing to say. It was a little, we don't do theology by cup size. I don't think he was being misogynistic, but
I didn't think it was being misogynistic.
No, it wasn't, but it was kind of flippant. So, but nevertheless, the outcry from, I'll just say, a lot of the online scholarly community just seemed to me like really over the top. I'm like, really? I mean, it's kind of like a Donald Trump comment. It's like, sometimes it's kind of crass, but it's not the worst thing. And what he was saying was actually kind of true. TV people like to get pretty people on their shows, and so I commented basically on one of their threads. I'm like, you guys are making way too much big deal about this. It's not that big of a deal. And they just jumped on me like crazy. A couple of them wrote articles about how I was this horrible plagiarist misogynist. I'm like, really? And it's so funny. It was so bad that I got a number of people like sending me messages like, are you okay? I'm like, I'm laughing at these people because these people are morons. I mean, who cares? At that point, I was back to teaching high school. I don't,
Yeah, okay, I thought it was funny, and you had very good responses, because I think her book, I didn't want to read her book because I don't, books like that are just so far-fetched.
Because of the response, I thought, I have to read this book. I have no idea I'd never heard of her before. And then I read her book.
So bad.
I can't even get offended by it. It's just funny. And if you, those of you who are watching, she makes her basic thesis in the whole book was the Old Testament as we have it. Again, and this part is true. Most of it was compiled and written probably during the exile. It was kind of put together by that time, but those exilic and post-exilic scribes were patriarchal misogynists who hated women, and they wanted to cover over the real history of Israel to make it look like they were all monotheists. And so therefore we have to get behind what they said and get to the true history of Israel. And so she interprets everything in the Old Testament through this, I would say, particularly modern progressive lens, where the most blatant one that I still laugh at is in Isaiah 6, when Isaiah is called to be a prophet, he says, in the year King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. This vision of the heavenly. She claims that Hebrew word that is translated as hem of robe really means penis. And he said God's penis was filling the temple. I was like, that doesn't make any sense. And other things. She just goes on. And it was so ridiculous. And I wanted to address it. But again, unlike a lot of in online culture where a lot of people just do like 5-minute videos, like clicky things, you can't really explain stuff. And so I didn't want to just like point out a couple things in a tweet, even though I did tweet a couple things like, oh my gosh, I never saw that before. I wanted to spend time where I kind of explain everything in her book. This is what she says in this chapter. I kind of did my best to just explain it. And then I critiqued it. And I think I ended up writing, I don't know, 10 posts.
Mm-hmm.
It was really enlightening. And it's a good example of the kind of the kind of biblical scholarship that I think is going off the rails. It's not all bad. I mean, there's a lot of great stuff. But there is this growing tendency by some scholars, and they're scholars, that they don't want to know the authorial intent of a text. They just have the assumption that whatever we're reading in the Old and New Testament, it's a con job, and somehow we got to get behind it to get to the true meaning. And always the true meaning is always somehow lines up with their current political ideologies.
Yeah, or sexualization. I mean, they clearly are sexualizing Isaiah 6, which doesn't have any of that in it at all. Yeah. It's just ridiculous.
Or another one was God had sex with Eve, and Cain was the child of Yahweh and Eve's sex. I'm like, when you read...
Did she say that? Did she actually said that?
Yeah.
She thinks so. Okay.
Because don't you know that when she gives birth to Cain, she says, with the help of Yahweh, I have brought forth a man. So therefore, that clearly means Yahweh had sex with her.
Oh my gosh.
I was like, you do know, right? In the same verse, right before that, it says, Adam knew Eve and they bore a child. It's like, yeah. It says, if you're going to get graphic, the one who had sex with Eve in that story we're told it was Adam. You know?
Yeah.
And so it's just, people are trying too hard to be edgy and provocative. And I read the book and it was just silly. And it got a lot of blowback. But there was one scholar who really liked it. And he got me, and it's not out yet, but I've kind of, over the last year, I've kind of taken those blog posts and I've kind of whittled them down into an article that should be, I'm not sure when it's coming out, but
good.
Yeah. It should be kind of fun. We'll see what response it gets.
Where's it going to come out? Do you know? Can you say? Or?
Oh, let me look it up.
Yeah, that's good news. So if you guys are just joining, I just wanted to say today we've been talking a lot about Joel's book, Blue Collar Reader's Guide to the New Testament. And so you guys want to be sure to go pick this up. I'm into it a little bit. He's got a lot of details, lots of very good digging into the Old Testament and into the New Testament. I mean, using a lot of the stuff from the Old Testament. And so it's really good that way. So you guys want to make sure you pick that up. And so, Joel, we're coming on like an hour and 15 minutes or so. I didn't know if there's anything else that we missed today that we should be talking about. Anything that, like, what I haven't gotten to get to yet in your book. Or
there's a lot of stuff. Oh, by the way, the name is the Canadian American Theological Review. It's not out yet, but
very cool.
But yeah, no, I think now that I'm back teaching full-time high school English, my biblical study stuff is now my side gig. For 25 years I was into it, but now my actual career doesn't deal with it. So, but yeah, hopefully, buy the book. Eventually there's a workbook that will come out with it. It's in the process of coming out. And then after that, hopefully there'll be an Old Testament reader's guide with a workbook. I don't know if there's a Kindle version of the reader's guide yet.
You know what I would recommend, Joel, and I think I think one thing that's changed in our culture, and I've been noticing this on my own stuff. I think one thing that's been changing in our culture is a lot of younger people aren't reading books. Like they're not reading physical books.
Good to have a hard copy, personally,
or an Audible. Yeah. Like if there's a way to get an Audible version, a lot of people are they're going to YouTube and listening and stuff like that. And so if you had somebody who could record audio for you, that'd be a good thing. That'd
be a long recording.
Yeah. What?
But yeah, I don't know if there's a Kindle version. I would just as an old timer, I would recommend a hardcover just because you can mark it up and it's easier. But like I said, there's going to be an Old Testament version coming out eventually. Hopefully down the road, I can have an early church fathers stuff.
Yeah, I would like that.
I have a blog. It's Resurrecting Orthodoxy. I think the actual, is it JoelEdmundAnderson.com?
Yeah, I don't know if I put links in the description to all your stuff, but I will. If I haven't gotten that, I will.
The actual website is joeledmundanderson.com. But
Mm-hmm.
if you probably find it by just Resurrecting Orthodoxy. I don't write on it as much as I used to because, but I'm trying to keep up with it. I have one or two more posts. I'm kind of going through. I'm taking the stuff from this book. I'm talking a little about Galatians right now, and then after that, because I'm doing English literature again. Every now and then I write some literary reviews. So if you want to learn more about literature too, woo, the door just opened by itself.
Ooh.
Hold on. Sometimes it doesn't always.
This is my friend Jansen. I got a lot of friends here in the chat, but this is my friend Jansen. He's from the UK, and he says, I really respect that you don't come down on the 1-2 church stuff, especially with me being a scruffy bottom of the pile Pentecostal. He always says a funny way to word things.
I grew up in the Assemblies of God church, but then I got saved. I'm kidding. Well, I mean, I did grow up in the Assemblies of God church, but yeah, I don't think anybody has to become Orthodox. I to this day, just my personal life, I think understanding more of ancient church tradition and the early church fathers, it illuminates so much stuff. I'll just, if I can just give one example.
Oh yeah.
Again, growing up in evangelicalism, sometimes the issues with baptism, do you immerse or do you sprinkle? Some people really get crazy about that. And then you read in the early church, 2nd century document, the Didache.
Yeah.
I can never say it. I should know that. I could read Greek. I just am horrible at pronunciation. You read it, and it addresses how to do baptism. And basically, it says, if you can baptize in a river, do it. If you can't, you can do it in a pool. If you can't do that, you can sprinkle. The point is, if they didn't freak out about the method, the important thing was making the declaration. You don't have to get upset over that. It shouldn't be an issue. Another good example is when you look at the early church fathers, take some controversial issue like abortion. And again, it is a tough issue to deal with, how.
And the Didache talks about that too.
Yeah. And it talks about that and other church fathers. And here's the interesting thing. A lot of other universally, the church fathers were against it.
Oh yeah.
Right. But at the same time, they made the distinction, like if a woman has done that, I'm summarizing it, it's kind of generalizing. She did sin, but she shouldn't be brought up on charges, So they're trying to weave, they're dealing with the same stuff we did, It is wrong, but sometimes, especially in that culture, men would pressure women to do things they didn't want. And so they're trying to exercise grace along with trying to decipher a really tough, controversial thing. And so, was there a Wheaton Assemblies of God church? The Assemblies of God church I grew up in was then called Calvary Temple. It's now called Calvary Church. But I went there when it was Calvary Temple. It was in Naperville.
No way. You grew up in Naperville?
Yeah.
I grew up in Aurora.
Get out.
Yeah, I was really close to Naperville. I lived in Sugar Grove, actually, for part of it. I lived in Aurora for part and Sugar Grove for part and Pressbury. I don't know if you know where that is.
I had one of my friends lives in Sugar Grove.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Small world.
When did you live in Sugar Grove?
I was born there and I lived in Aurora. Then I was in Sugar Grove, but I lived there up until 1985 when I moved down here.
Okay. Well, the first time I didn't live in
Sugar
Grove until the 90s. So
yeah,
it's kind of funny. Yeah,
I grew up
every year, every Sunday, because we lived in Carroll Stream.
Okay.
Which is like half hour north of Naperville. So
you probably went to Fox Valley Mall?
Occasionally. We went to Stratford Square because that was right near my house. But yeah, if we would go to church, we would go up 59 or go down 59, a half hour drive to Calvary Temple.
Wow. Yeah. Small world. It's definitely a small world.
I was going to say, if you would have said, oh yeah, I know that Sugar Grove connection, but you don't, because she wasn't even there. But yeah, I grew up in Carroll Stream, went to Calvary Temple all through high school. Then it was at the end of my high school time where I read Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, and I started thinking through my faith, and I just, it's time to move on. I went to Willow Creek Community Church for a couple of years in my college years when it was kind of big with Bill Hybels. And then eventually after college, that it seemed a little shallow to me. And then eventually I got into more and more liturgical stuff to where now I'm part of the liturgical stuff church. Now. What?
So, yeah, I see. I'm a Catholic revert. I don't know if you know that. So,
we talked about that. Yeah, I think the first time I did a video with you probably was back in, I don't know, 2016.
That was when I was full on Protestant, Baptist. But I think for me, it's like with new information, I'm willing to change my mind. I see these people. I just saw a video by Trent Horn, and he was talking about destiny and destiny's desire to be completely consistent with his worldview, that everything's morally relative. And it's funny. It's like when you try to be consistent, if someone said you need to be consistent with your 2016 view, I'd be like, no, sorry, I evolve. I change my mind.
Yeah. I mean, that's how you learn. You have to be open to open to learning new things, and like, oh, I was wrong on that. Shows humility,
Yeah.
And that's why, like, a lot of the stuff in the book and, everything, I definitely have my views and I'll state them. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff this idea, and I guess this is one of the things I've noticed, and it's probably more in evangelicalism is, this insistence that you have to be certain about everything. It's like, you can't, in a walk of faith, a lot of times you're not that certain. That's why it's called faith. There's certain things I know pretty well. I'm good, hard convictions, but there's a lot I don't know, and that's okay. And so you need to be okay with that. And there's nothing wrong with it.
I totally agree. So, well, good. Well, thank you. Anyway, thank you so much for coming in here, Joel. I really enjoyed the conversation. If you guys haven't seen this yet, go ahead and pick up Joel's book. It's Reader's Guide to the New Testament. So it's definitely something you want to get. And it's you can go to his website called Resurrecting Orthodoxy, or at joeledmundanderson.com. And so I want to say thank you to everybody in the chat for coming in here. And any last final parting shots?
No. Yeah, I would just say, if you contact, keep up with me on my blog, then when new things come out, I'll obviously promote them the best I can.
And keep following around those atheists to make sure that they're saying the right thing.
Sometimes it's just so every now and then I get on Twitter just to see what they're saying. And you followed with a couple of them whom I will not.
Oh yeah.
I view them as Voldemort. I will not name them.
The atheists that remain unnamed.
But they're so, and one more thing with the Francesca Stavropoulos thing. What really got the ire of a lot of them is when I started reading the book, I think I posted a couple tweets just like, oh my gosh, Yahweh's penis filled the temple. Why wasn't I taught that in graduate school? Haha. And they were like, they wrote these long screeds about how, like, they got really nasty and personal. Like, you don't even know me. Why do you think I'm going to be upset about this? But it's just, they've released a new one.
They've released a new. Yeah, who's the they? Is that Francesca? Maybe she's got another book.
Read her anymore. That's another one I wrote. After I read that one, I read another book later that year by Esther Hamorai. It's called God's Monsters.
Oh my gosh!
It's again. Oh, those guys! You've uttered their names.
The names are in the chat. You guys are going to have to wait till the chat comes up if you're getting in here without the chat.
But this other book, God's Monsters, it talks about all the crazy, fantastical monsters in the Old and New Testament, which is true. There are, like, the way we view seraphim and cherubim, and Leviathan, but most of the book is really, they just take those, and like the conclusion of the book is that these monsters really work for God, and God is the ultimate evil, and you're like, God really loves Leviathan, and he doesn't care about humanity.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, come on. But people gravitate toward that. And I don't understand, because in my view, it's just silly. I don't even get upset about it. And so I kind of, those blog posts are fun to write about, because it's just like,
it's so ridiculous.
So yeah, if you want to read about that, God's Monsters, just type in God's Monsters in my search bar, and you can read a few posts about that book too.
Oh, that sounds good.
Yeah, but after a while, I mean, you can only do that so much. After a while, you feel dirty dealing with that stuff, so you want to like back away from it and like go read some quality stuff and be more uplifting. But
I agree. It's the same thing for me. Sometimes I think about which videos I'll respond to, and I'll listen to a couple of their videos and I'll think, why am I spending this time? I just wasted an hour of my time. And I realize that God's going to hold me accountable for that.
Yeah. Well, it's one of those things where you want to engage with other views, and it kind of keeps you sharp. You should read all of them, Jensen. Read everything I've ever written. But actually, I think one of the first things that when we first met is like you were having a debate, an argument with Richard Carrier, the mythologist.
Oh yeah.
And so I got his book and I read it and I was like, oh my gosh, this guy's a nut.
Yeah.
And it's just like, and it's kind of interesting to read for the first time because like people actually believe this, but after a while you're like, okay, I gotta.
I always think like with him, I always think people are funny when they refer to other people as their fans. Like he refers to people who read his stuff as his fans. And I think I would never call somebody a fan of mine. Even if I were like a famous movie star, just the word fans, that turns me off so much.
Yeah. It shows the indication of a really big ego. But that's the one good thing. If I'm grateful of having taught in Christian schools high schools for 16 years, and now I'm teaching high school again. Even though I have a PhD, I teach high school. It keeps you humble. I'm being a human being. We're all susceptible to getting arrogant in certain ways, but every time there's a temptation to get arrogant, I'm like, tomorrow I'm going to be going to deal with 16-year-olds. I'm not that great of a person.
No, God. Well, I think God puts us in his place every time. Anytime I've ever shown pride in my life, I pretty much was knocked down to the ground right after. So.
And I'm glad. I'm glad to teach high school because it does keep you out of that. There is a temptation in academia, no matter what topic it is, especially in biblical studies, to be, I'm really smart. All these peons don't know anything, and which is the antithesis of what the gospel is about, And so I'm kind of glad that in a certain way, I'm kind of glad I'm out of that world because
it's a tricky, I'm in that world and that is a tricky thing, but it's like one of those things where I let students, they can, if they call me my first name, if they call me doctor, if they call me professor, whatever they want to call me. I know other people who get really offended if they're not called doctor in their last name. Yeah. And so it's just, I think to myself, like Jill Biden, she's Dr. Jill Biden. And it's a doctor and it was a hard degree to earn for sure, but I'm not a medical doctor. So I don't put it in my title on Twitter or any place like that. Yeah. So.
Well, yeah, when I'll put it on my books. Did I put it on this book? No, I didn't.
But you could put PhD after it. Like that's legit.
Well, I do mention it there.
You should. You should definitely, because you have a PhD in a relevant study. You're in Old Testament, so it's totally.
It's funny because now that I teach high school English at a charter school here, the kids know I have a doctorate in biblical studies and stuff, but they're not used to saying Dr. Anderson. So like the last couple of years, it's just kind of joke. They call me Mr. Doctor, Mr. Dr. Anderson.
That's funny.
So it is what it is. But yeah, this has been fun. Hopefully people have enjoyed the chat. If you do have any other, I would say just any other questions about biblical stuff or early church father stuff, if you sign up on my blog and you can contact me through there, that's totally fine. It'll be.
Oh, that's how it is. Okay. Yeah, because I was trying to reach. I for some reason Twitter or X was not taking my posts at one point, and so I went to your blog and I was trying to find a way to contact you, and then I went back to X and found that I could post on there. So that's
okay. Yeah, I have the blog. You can contact me through Twitter. If you Twitter X, if you become my friend, and if I really get to know you and I like you, you can be my Facebook friend. But
yeah, very good. So thank you, everybody. Otangelo's here, so thanks to Otangelo. He has a lot of good stuff on the Shroud of Turin. So he's been on my he's been here on my channel before talking about the Shroud of Turin in his book. And so we'll promote that too. And so you guys, thank you. If any of you are listening now and you've written a book and you'd like to talk about it on my channel, a book on Christianity, especially, that would be something that I would love to share. So I love to promote authors, and I'm going to put this into an area where you can find the Christian authors who are putting out books. And so thank you so much, Joel.
All right.
Okay,
Thanks.
so everybody just remember, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do, do it all for God's glory. Thank you.
All right.